The first sound Elias heard that morning was the wind, not loud, not angry, just steady. It slid across the open land and brushed the sides of the small cabin as if testing it. He lay still beneath a quilt that smelled of wool and wood smoke and listened until he could tell which direction the gusts were coming from. North. Always north when the cold wanted to prove something. Elias was 17 years old, tall for his age, still narrow in the shoulders, with hands already thickened by work. He lived with his mother on a rise of land where the prairie tipped gently toward a shallow creek. There were no trees close enough to block the wind, only grass cut short by summer and turned brittle by autumn. The cabin stood like a promise that had not yet been fully kept. He rose quietly so as not to wake her. Outside, frost glazed the ground, and the sky held that pale, stretched look that came before a hard season. Elias pulled on his boots and stepped into the cold. His breath came white and quick. He crossed the yard to the small shed where the tools hung, running his hand along the handle of the spade as if greeting it. Behind the cabin, the hill rose higher than it seemed from a distance. Elias had chosen it for a reason he had trouble putting into words. When he pressed his palm against the soil there, it felt different, cooler in summer, steadier. The ground did not hurry. The neighbors did not understand why he kept measuring that slope, why he paced it and marked it with pegs and string. They understood plowing and fencing. They understood barns and sod walls. What Elias was planning did not fit neatly into anything they already knew. "You can't eat dirt," one of them had called out the day before, leaning on a fence rail with a grin meant to sound friendly. "Best put your time into firewood." Elias had nodded, because nodding cost less than explaining. He had learned that already. He began to dig. At first, the hole was only an outline, a shallow cut where the spade bit cleanly. The earth smelled damp and old. He worked slowly, placing each shovelful to the side in neat rows. The rhythm settled into him, and with it came a quiet focus. Dig, lift, turn, step. The wind moved around him, but the ground answered back with weight and patience. By midday, the sun stood higher, though it gave little warmth. Elias paused to drink from his canteen and looked at the cut he had made. It was not impressive yet. That was all right. He had learned that the beginning of things rarely was. His companion watched from a distance, a shepherd mix dog with a thick coat and an even thicker loyalty. The dog lay where he could see both the cabin door and the boy, ears lifting now and then at sounds Elias could not hear. When Elias moved, the dog's tail thumped once against the ground, then stilled again. Elias returned to work. He had been taught to build with care by his father, years earlier, back when the cabin still smelled new and the future felt wider. His father had talked about how the land behaved if you listened long enough, how earth held temperature, how air liked to move if you gave it space. Elias did not have all the words for it, but he had the memory of hands guiding his, of quiet explanations given without hurry. The hole deepened. By evening, Elias had reached a depth where the air felt different, less sharp. He stood at the bottom and looked up at the sky framed by cut earth. It already felt sheltered, even unfinished. That told him he was on the right path. Over the next days, he dug from dawn until the light faded. His hands blistered, then toughened. His shoulders ached, then adjusted. The dog followed him from hole to cabin and back again, carrying small sticks, offering company without questions. People came to watch. Some stood at a distance. Others wandered closer, curiosity loosening their caution. They asked what he was building. Elias said he was making a place that would help them through winter. That answer satisfied no one and offended no one enough to start an argument. "You'd be better off stacking more wood," an older woman said, not unkindly. "I am," Elias replied, and went back to digging. When the hole reached the depth he wanted, he began lining it. Cottonwood logs came first, cut and trimmed by hand. He laid them carefully across the span, testing each one before moving to the next. The work was slow and exacting. His dog sat close, watching the logs shift into place, head tilted as if memorizing the pattern. After the logs came straw, laid thick and loose, then clay-rich soil, packed down firm until it resisted his weight, then prairie grass, still green, arranged so it could breathe. Finally, earth again, returned layer by layer to its place above. By the time the ceiling was finished, the structure blended into the hill. Only the entrance remained visible, a narrow opening facing away from the worst of the wind. Elias built a double door there, offset just enough to trap the air between them. He tested it with his hand, opening and closing, feeling how the cold slowed before reaching inside. The interior took longer. Elias divided the space with intention, not symmetry. Gravel in one area, sand in another, bare earth in the back corner. Shelves were suspended on posts that did not touch the walls. He left small gaps where air could move without being noticed. Each decision came from observation rather than formula. When he finally carried the first crates of vegetables inside, the comments grew sharper. "That's your whole winter," a neighbor said, eyes widening. "All in one place. It's where they'll do best," Elias answered. He had measured the temperature already, using a small thermometer he had saved for and ordered months before. The needle barely moved, even when the days turned warm again. While other cellars heated and cooled with the weather, this place stayed steady. Not warm, not cold. Waiting, the real test came later. The wind strengthened. Snow followed. Then came the cold that made sound feel brittle. Cabins creaked, doors stuck fast, root cellars froze, then failed. People lost what they had counted on. One morning, a knock came at Elias's door before dawn. A neighbor stood there, wrapped tight, eyes tired. "I heard yours didn't freeze," he said, not meeting Elias's gaze. "Is it true?" Elias pulled on his coat and led him to the hillside. When the doors opened, the air inside felt like another season entirely. Cool, calm, the vegetables looked unchanged, as if time had decided to pass them by. Word spread. People came quietly at first, then in groups. They asked questions. Elias answered what he could. When he did not have words, he showed them instead. He pointed to layers, to spaces, to the way the earth pressed in gently from all sides. By the end of that winter, the laughter had faded. In its place grew something steadier. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. Elias did not need to name it. He stood one evening at the entrance, watching the last light slip across the prairie. The dog leaned against his leg, solid and warm. Below them, the ground held fast, listening, keeping what it had been trusted with. This was only the beginning. Winter did not arrive all at once. It pressed in slowly, testing corners and seams, learning where people were careless. The wind hardened first, then the nights lengthened. Frost lingered past morning. Elias noticed how sound carried farther when the air thinned, how even the dog seemed to listen more closely before choosing a place to lie. The hillside held. Inside the dug shelter, the air stayed calm. Elias checked the thermometer each morning before tending the stove in the cabin. The needle rested where he expected it to rest, steady as a held breath. He did not smile at it. He only nodded and closed the door carefully behind him. People began to come not just to look, but to ask. They arrived with questions shaped by loss. A cellar that had turned hard as stone, apples that had gone soft and sour, potatoes ruined before they could be stretched through the season. Elias listened without interrupting. He had learned that listening was part of building. When he spoke, he kept his words simple. He pointed instead to the ceiling that made shallow ground behave like deep ground, to the layers that trapped air and slowed change, to the way the entrance turned the wind aside without fighting it. Some understood at once. Others needed to see the same explanation twice, 3 times, from different angles. Elias did not hurry them. The dog stayed near, shifting when new people stepped inside, then settling again. Children reached to touch his fur. and he accepted the attention with patient dignity, as if this too was part of the work. The cold deepened. One night, the wind rose hard enough to wake Elias from sleep. The cabin walls complained softly, wood adjusting to strain. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The sky was clear and sharp, stars fixed and bright. He walked to the hillside and rested his hand against the earth above the shelter. It felt unchanged. That steadiness eased something in his chest he had not realized was tight. By morning, the temperature had dropped further. Breath crystallized. Snow squeaked underfoot. People moved with care, conserving heat, conserving strength, and still, the hillside held. When the worst of the cold came, it came without warning. The wind cut sideways. The air burned the lungs. Animals pressed close to fences and barns, seeking any break in the open land. Elias heard later how some cellars failed in a single night, the contents lost before anyone could intervene. That morning, the first knock came before the sun. A woman stood outside, wrapped in layers that could not hide the tremor in her hands. She did not waste time on apology or pride. "We've got little left," she said. "I was told to ask you." Elias nodded and took his lantern. He led her to the hillside, opened the doors, and stepped aside to let her feel the change for herself. She stopped at the threshold, eyes closing for a moment as the cold loosened its grip. Inside, the vegetables waited. Not perfect, perhaps, but whole, usable, alive in the quiet way stored things can be alive. Word moved faster than the wind after that. People came with baskets, sacks, careful hopes. Elias did not give everything. He shared enough to keep others through the worst days, trusting that what remained would continue to hold. He did not calculate generosity as a risk. He treated it like another layer, another part of the structure that kept everything stable. In the evenings, he began to teach. They gathered inside the shelter, lanterns throwing soft light across the walls. Elias stood with his back to the earth and explained what he had done and why. When he lacked words, he drew shapes in the dirt. He let others touch the layers, feel the difference between packed clay and loose straw, between gravel and sand. Questions came slower now, shaped by respect rather than doubt. "What if you don't have straw?" someone asked. "Then you find what traps air," Elias replied. "Dry grass, leaves, sawdust if you can get it. The idea matters more than the material." "What about water?" another asked. "You give it a place to go," he said, tapping the gravel floor. "You don't fight it, you guide it." They took notes. Some returned the next day with measurements scratched onto boards, with sketches drawn from memory. Elias checked their plans and pointed out small changes. He never took charge of another person's build. He only steadied it. Outside, the winter wore on. More shelters appeared along nearby slopes. Some were shallow, some deeper. Some failed at first and were adjusted. Elias visited when asked, bringing his spade, his eye, and his patience. The dog followed, trotting ahead, then circling back, as if counting everyone present. There were moments of doubt. One evening, Elias stood alone inside his shelter after the lanterns had been extinguished. The dark pressed close, and for the first time since autumn, he allowed himself to consider what would happen if this place stopped holding. The thought passed through him like a cold current. He acknowledged it and let it move on. Worry did not build walls. Work did. He returned to the cabin and fed the stove. By midwinter, the pattern was clear. Where the ground was treated with understanding, it responded with steadiness. Where people rushed or copied without care, problems followed. Elias did not judge. He helped fix what could be fixed. The day the thaw finally began, it felt almost unreal. Snow softened. Drips sounded from eaves. The air smelled faintly of wet earth beneath ice. People stepped outside without bracing themselves for pain. Inside the shelter, the temperature barely shifted. Elias brought out vegetables that had been stored since autumn and cooked them simply. He shared the meal with those who had helped him build, those who had listened when listening was hard. They ate in quiet appreciation, tasting not just food but the relief of having endured. That spring, the work changed but did not stop. People wanted to improve what they had built. They asked about adding vents, about lining walls with stone, about adjusting entrances to better catch or block the wind. Elias encouraged careful changes, one at a time, so results could be understood. A woman who kept careful records began writing everything down: temperatures, weather, what worked and what did not. Elias read her notes and nodded approval. Memory mattered, but so did records. As the ground softened, planting began again. Elias worked his plot with renewed focus. The shelter behind him held more than food now. It held proof, confidence, a way of thinking that spread quietly, without announcement. One afternoon, a visitor arrived from farther away, having heard of what had been built. He walked the hillside, asked sharp questions, tested the air with a skeptic's hand. Elias answered steadily. The visitor left thoughtful rather than convinced, which Elias considered progress. The dog slept in the shade, belly rising and falling, unconcerned with arguments. By summer, the shelter had become part of the land. Grass grew thick over its roof. From a distance, you would not know it was there. Elias liked that. The best things did not need to announce themselves. He stood one evening at the entrance, watching the sun lower and the prairie glow. The wind was gentle now, almost kind. He rested his hand against the door and felt the cool steadiness beneath it. The ground had listened. What remained was to see how far that listening could carry. Summer did not undo what winter had taught them. It softened the land, yes, and filled the low places with green. But the memory of cold remained in the way people planned their days. Elias felt it when he woke before dawn, when the air still carried a cool edge and the ground smelled alive. He felt it in the careful way neighbors talked about fall, as if naming it too early might invite trouble. The hillside shelter stayed quiet. Elias checked it less often now, not because it mattered less, but because it had proven itself. When he did step inside, he noticed small changes that only came with time. The clay had tightened further. The straw had settled into a firm, springy layer. The air moved with more confidence, finding its paths without instruction. The place had learned its own balance. People kept building. They did not copy exactly. Elias had never asked them to. Some added stone where they had it. Others used different grasses or packed earth mixed with ash. One family dug deeper and made a narrower entrance. Another widened the interior and learned, after a humid week, why shelves needed air beneath them. Each adjustment added to a growing understanding that lived between them, shared in short conversations at fences and longer ones at the shelter's door. A few came who wanted certainty. "How thick does it have to be?" they asked. Elias would pause, considering. "Thick enough that the ground forgets the day," he said. Then he would show them how to test, how to feel for steadiness rather than measure for perfection. Some left frustrated, others stayed and learned. The dog followed Elias through all of it, moving easily between people, lying where the work gathered. Children learned his name before they learned the word for what Elias had built. He accepted their hands and their laughter without complaint, eyes half closed, tail tapping now and then against the earth. As summer deepened, a quiet disagreement took shape. A man from a distant claim arrived with the look of someone who had made up his mind before asking questions. He walked the hillside, inspected the entrance, tapped the ceiling layers with a stick, as if listening for weakness. When he spoke, his voice carried. "This works now," he said, "but what about years from now? When the logs rot, when the layers shift, you can't count on dirt forever." Elias did not answer immediately. He knelt and pressed his palm to the ground, then invited the man to do the same. The man hesitated, then complied. "Feel how it changes," Elias said. "Not fast. Slow. The ground doesn't forget quickly." "That's not proof," the man replied. "No," Elias agreed. "It's practice." They parted without agreement. Elias watched him go, neither angry nor worried. Doubt, he had learned, was a tool. It just had to be used in the right direction. That autumn, Elias harvested more than before. The soil had responded to steady care, and the weather had favored patience. He stored the new vegetables alongside what remained from the previous year, careful to keep them where they belonged. The shelter accepted them without comment, the air adjusting as it always did. When the first frost came, it came gently. People noticed. They noticed because they were watching now. Thermometers hung in more places. Doors were built with more thought. Entrances turned away from wind instead of meeting it head-on. Elias did not take credit. He simply nodded when someone said, "It held." The second winter tested different things. There were stretches of warmth that confused the surface, and periods of sudden cold that arrived without warning. Snow melted and refroze, sealing mistakes into ice. The shelters that had been built with care adapted. Those that had been rushed needed attention. Elias moved between them with his spade and his quiet focus, showing how to add, how to remove, how to let the structure breathe again. One evening, he stayed late at a neighbor's place, adjusting a vent pipe they had added too close to the ceiling. The dog lay nearby, chin on paws, watching breath fog the air. When they finished, the neighbor stood back and laughed softly. "I thought this was about digging," he said. "Turns out it's about waiting." Elias smiled, just once. By midwinter, people began to talk about the future in longer terms. Not just the next storm, but the next year, the year after that. They spoke of what they might pass on, not just in land, but in understanding. Elias listened, saying little, aware that this was the shape trust took when it settled. A woman who had been keeping records brought him a small stack of papers, temperatures, humidity notes, dates. She had drawn careful diagrams and labeled each layer. Elias studied them and suggested a few clarifications. She asked if she could share them more widely. "Yes," he said. "Just tell them to watch their ground." Late that winter, something unexpected happened. A group arrived from beyond the nearest settlements, traveling light, faces set with purpose. They had heard, not of a shelter, but of a way of thinking. They asked not just how to build, but how to decide, how to know when enough was enough, how to trust something you could not see working every day. Elias took them to the hillside at dusk. He opened the doors and let them feel the change. He showed them the layers and the shelves and the floors. Then he closed the doors again and stood with them outside, facing the wind. "You build so the ground does the work," he said. "Then you leave it alone." They stayed longer than they planned. When spring returned again, it felt earned. The thaw came clean this time, without loss. People emerged from winter with more than relief. They carried confidence shaped by experience rather than hope alone. Elias expanded his field slightly, careful not to outrun his capacity. He repaired tools, sharpened blades, replaced what had worn thin. The shelter remained, unchanged and essential, its roof now thick with grass and wildflowers that drew bees. Sometimes, Elias sat above it in the evening, back against the slope, the dog pressed warm against his side. He listened to the prairie settle into night and thought about how much of what mattered happened out of sight. Roots deepening, soil holding moisture, air moving through spaces made for it. He had not set out to teach, he had set out to endure. Yet endurance, shared, had become something else. A language people learned without realizing they were learning it. A way of working that did not announce itself but left clear results. As the year turned, Elias sensed that the shelter had reached a new stage. Not finished, exactly, but complete enough to carry others forward. The ground had accepted its role. The people had accepted theirs. What remained was time, and time, Elias knew now, could be shaped if you listened closely enough to what the ground was already saying. The third spring arrived without ceremony. No sharp turn in the weather, no single morning that announced itself as different. Instead, Warmth returned the way trust does gradually, then all at once, until one day Elias realized he had stopped bracing himself when he stepped outside. The hillside had changed again. Wildflowers had taken hold across the roof of the shelter, their roots threading gently through the upper soil without disturbing what lay beneath. Bees worked the blossoms, moving with quiet purpose. From a distance, the place looked untouched, as if the land had decided to keep a small secret for itself. Elias liked that most of all. He continued his routines, checking fences, turning soil, repairing what winter had worn thin. He did not visit the shelter every day anymore. He knew where it was. He knew what it did. That was enough. People still came. Some came to thank him, though he waved that away. Others came to show what they had built, proud in a reserved way, pointing out layers and vents, explaining choices. Elias listened closely, asking questions that made them pause and think. He was pleased not when they copied him, but when they understood why they had done something differently. The woman with the careful records returned with a bound stack of pages. She had added notes from others, sketches from different builds, small observations written in margins. She asked Elias to look it over one last time. He did, slowly. "It's good," he said. "It leaves room." "For what?" she asked. "For people to notice things you didn't," he replied. They agreed that copies would be shared freely. No charge, no claim, just guidance and reminders to pay attention. That summer, Elias noticed a change in how people talked. They spoke less about surviving the next season and more about planning several ahead. They discussed planting choices in terms of storage. They built entrances with the wind in mind. They chose hillsides not for convenience but for steadiness. The language of endurance had settled into everyday speech. One afternoon, the same man who had doubted the shelter years earlier returned. He walked the hillside again, slower this time, eyes tracing the curve of the land. "It's still holding," he said, not accusing, not surprised. "Yes," Elias replied. The man nodded. "I built one." Elias waited. "It took me 2 tries." The man continued. "First one failed. Second one's better. Not perfect." "Nothing is," Elias said. They stood together for a while, listening to the insects move through the grass. When the man left, he did not argue. He carried something quieter with him. The dog grew older, though he did not act like it. His muzzle lightened, his pace slowed just enough to notice. He still followed Elias everywhere, still chose his place near the shelter entrance when people gathered, as if guarding something shared. That autumn, Elias stored vegetables from 3 seasons at once. The oldest were few now, but they remained usable, reminders more than supplies. He kept them where they belonged, separate, and watched. When he cooked them, he did so simply, sharing them with those who understood what they represented. They tasted the same as the new ones. That was the point. A small gathering formed one evening near the hillside, lanterns set low against the wind. People talked quietly, not celebrating so much as acknowledging. Elias listened more than he spoke. When asked why he had trusted the ground the way he did, he thought for a long moment before answering. "Because it was already doing the work," he said. "I just stopped getting in the way." Winter came again, as it always would. It was not as severe as the first, but it tested different things. Long stretches of damp cold, sudden freezes after brief thaws. The shelters responded according to how they had been built. Some needed attention, some held without comment. Elias helped where asked, stepping back when not needed. One night, during a storm that rattled shutters and flattened drifts, Elias woke and listened. He did not get up right away. He waited, feeling the shape of the sound. When he finally stepped outside, the cold met him sharply, but it did not alarm him. He walked to the hillside. The dog followed, steady and sure. Elias rested his hand against the earth and felt the same quiet firmness he had felt years before. He stood there longer than necessary, not because he doubted, but because he wanted to remember what certainty felt like when it was earned. By morning, the storm had passed. The shelters had done their work. Spring returned once more, and with it came visitors from farther away. They did not arrive out of desperation now, but curiosity. They had heard of a place where people worked with the land rather than against it. Elias showed them what mattered and let them discover the rest. He never claimed ownership of the idea. He did not need to. As seasons continued their steady turning, the shelter became less a marvel and more a given. New families learned about it the way they learned about planting times and windbreaks. It was part of the place now, woven into how things were done. Elias aged into his strength. He remained lean, quiet, deliberate. His hands carried the marks of long work, his movements the economy of someone who had learned not to waste effort. The dog stayed at his side until age slowed him fully, then stayed close in a different way, content to watch. On evenings when the light stretched long across the prairie, Elias sometimes sat above the shelter and thought about what would remain when he was gone. Not the structure itself, that would eventually return to the hill, layers blending back into soil. What would remain was the understanding. That ground could be trusted if you listened. That steadiness was built, not hoped for. That sharing what you knew strengthened everyone, including yourself. He watched the wind move through grass and felt no urge to name the moment. Some things were complete without being declared finished. When people spoke of Elias later, they did not talk much about him as a person. They talked about how their food kept through winter, how their shelters stayed calm when the world outside did not, how they learned to wait and observe before acting. Elias considered that enough. One final evening, long after the shelter had become just another part of the land, Elias stood at its entrance as the sun lowered. The dog leaned against his leg, warm and familiar. Elias opened the doors, checked the air, and closed them again. Careful as always, the hillside remained still. The ground listened, and it kept what it had been trusted with, season after season, long after the laughter had faded, long after doubt had found other places to go. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider to hype our video to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.